So, continuing on with our exploration of the rise of the Roman Empire, which will eventually lead us into the medieval world. Remember, that is, after all, the very purpose of what we're trying to engage in this course of study. Um, where we left off, the Roman Republic had risen on the scene, the world stage, and been largely able to take over the most important geopolitical centers of at least the Western world. And here I mean Western as far as anything west of, I don't know, um, what is modern day Iran or something like that. Uh, Not necessarily West in the way that we're going to use West in the latter half of this course, which is going to divide what we sometimes refer to as the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire from the Western. Okay, nonetheless, the Roman Republic has taken over a huge and very important section of the world at this point. Uh, and there are cracks that are beginning to show in the system. Most importantly, at least for what we discussed, one of the major theses as far as why the Republic begins to crack is slowly but surely land and other sources of power, not the least is money, begin to get accumulated into the hands of the few. Fewer and fewer and fewer as this progresses. And if this was just money, this might actually be okay for the Roman Empire. But what actually becomes a much bigger problem is this happens with the farmland. And the reason that's a problem for Rome in particular, the Roman Republic, is because the military really functioned off of this personal buy-in that people had to the military because they owned farmland. And so as farmland becomes more monopolized by people in large regions known as the latifundia, less people are more inclined to serve in the military, and like I said, cracks begin to show. It became evident after not very long that this was going to be a problem that the Republic needed to address. And so Tiberius Gracchus begins to stage a rebellion. He is one of the members of the Populares, which are opposed to the Optimates. The Populares are what we might think of as like, if we were to use Marxist language, which a lot of historians sometimes compare the fall of Rome to some of the things that Marx is talking about. I don't think that's a particularly great thesis, spoiler alert, and I have some serious concerns of reading history like that. But to use the language that's sometimes used by historians, you have kind of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie that are dividing up the Roman Republic, where the proletariat is kind of the working class, and those would be the people that support them would be the populares. Now, the populares are a political entity, and they are people at least that say they have the interest of people who are poor, the peasants. That's a bit of an anachronistic term here, but people who are living off of a day's wages rather than their farmland. And the optimates are the people who are more or less wanting to keep the status quo. Well, Tiberius and his later brother Gaius Gracchus are populares, and they want to create reform, and they want to do so by going around the Senate. This is actually the reason that Tiberius is executed, because he wants to redistribute the latifundia to the people who need the land that don't have large amounts of wealth at their immediate disposal. This causes a series of different reforms that cascade, including the reforms of Marius, who recognizes that if he controls the empire, if he controls the military, he controls the empire. And so Marius wants to bring about those exact same reforms as Tiberius, but he is going to do so rather than just going around the Senate. He's going to do so by wielding the forces of the military as a general. And this kind of exposes a critical flaw in the Republic, namely that because at this point in history, and we're going to see this even for a ways down for the empire, is the military is so intimately connected with what the government even is. It's not really as categorized into different branches as we think of it now, and so to wield the military becomes a way of wielding the Republic as a whole. And Marius was able to sell land. Basically, he wasn't actually selling it for money, but he was getting land from politicians, promised land from politicians and wealthy land rich donors, and then using that in order to make promises to people who would be willing to fight for him, and they would make allegiance to him, or they would make allegiance to his chunk of the Roman army, if you will. And this became a bit of a problem because it was exposing kind of the whole scheme behind how the Roman Republic worked, and everyone was realizing this is not quite the democracy that we maybe thought it was. Not that there was ever any pretense that it was a pure democracy in any sense of the word, but suddenly it was clear that, here's a way to wield power. Ironically, Lucius Cornelius Sulla comes up after Marius and reinstitutes power, wields another powerful military against Marius's attempted reforms, and puts the power back in the hands of the Senate. This is well and fine until, of course, it's revealed that everyone now knows how to manipulate the Roman Empire, or what's going to become the Roman Empire, right? If you wield the military, you wield the keys of Rome. No pun intended there for what we're going to see later in the history of Rome. This opens the door to a couple of different powerful generals, two of which were also consuls in the Roman Republic, Pompey, Crassus, and most famously Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar. They come together to form kind of a coalition over a military coalition, which is called the Triumvirate. And this military coalition splits the empire in terms of power between these three men. And that kind of works because they're able to keep each other at enough tension. They're all military leaders. Crassus had famously kind of squashed the Spartacan rebellion, so he had a long-standing history of making sure people didn't spark out into various different rebellions of different types. And this works for a period of time until Crassus dies. And so suddenly there is a power imbalance, and it becomes clear that only one person is going to lead this. Once this becomes clear, the Senate realizes they do not want Caesar in charge, Gaius Julius Caesar. And the reason for that is because they know that Gaius Julius Caesar is a military genius. They know that at this point on, I believe it was already clear that he was having an affair with Cleopatra in the East, and they were worried about potential geopolitical threats, to use an anachronistic term, that there would be some very worrying alliances from that relationship. And we'll see that in the future that becomes a bigger worry as well, too, for Julius Caesar's adopted son. Nonetheless, the Senate makes clear that they do not want Julius Caesar to be in control. And so they put their weight behind Pompey, and they tell Julius Caesar basically to cease and desist while he is in what is at the time Gaul, even into the area that is more along the Piedmonte, northern Italy, and the foot of the mountains there. And he knows that by the time he arrives at the river that's blocking his way, the Rubicon, that he will need to make a very clear decision at this point, that if he crosses the Rubicon, he will lead a military conquest into Rome, and he will be disobeying the wishes of the Senate, in full rebellion of the Senate, and now you have a general that's seeking power over the Senate. In other words, you will have something like a dictatorship that is done by his own free will. And so he does this. He crosses the Rubicon in 79 AD. He enters into Rome. He defeats the military that are against him with his military, with his armies. And a few years later, he declares himself to be dictator for life. And of course, this is what's going to eventually get him killed as well. The Senate has profound mistrust issues in him, kind of from the get-go. But even more worrisome is he lives a rather lavish and opulent lifestyle. He loves to wear purples. He has a golden crown that's made of laurels. Well, it's made to look like it's of laurels, so he's declaring himself to kind of this perpetual victor. He's never using the language of king. He never uses the later language of emperor. Instead, he's wanting simply to play the role of king without the title. And people notice. Indeed, there is kind of one rather famous scene where Marcus Aurelius is going to, they're at one of the many public games, I believe, a very public arena. And Marcus Aurelius goes to crown him as the king of Rome with a diadem. And he crowns him once, and Julius Caesar, seemingly noticing the crowd's shock and horror at this, says, no, I cannot wear a crown. He crowns him again. He says, no, I can't wear a crown. He crowns him once again, and finally Caesar says, no, I will not wear this crown. In fact, the only person that can wear a crown is Jupiter. And so, I'm sorry, I just realized I was saying Marcus Aurelius. We'll see him later. Mark Antony takes the crown and he throws it to Jupiter's statue, which is right there. There was a lot of rumblings that Caesar wanted to be king. Indeed, he also had this rather large throne. It wasn't called a throne, but it was a golden chair. And people began to get worried until finally a conspiracy of senators plots to kill him. And they do just that famously on the Ides of March. With that, it becomes questionable who in the world is going to take the place of Caesar. There have been civil wars still for a long period of time, and so there's a question of, like, do we get the Senate up and going again? And that's a possibility, and kind of restore the Republic. But realistically, there's so many people that are pining for power at this point, including many members of the Senate, that it becomes clear after a short period of time, no, someone is actually going to take this. And so Mark Antony, who I just mentioned when I was falsely claiming Marcus Aurelius, Mark Antony is one of the leading figures of this. He was Julius Caesar's right-hand man for a long period of time. And it was thought that he was going to take over this. It was thought maybe that a few members of the Senate were going to take over the empire. And then there was this kind of lone wolf figure who not a lot of people were familiar with. He was probably 18 years old at the time. Octavian. And Octavian was close to Caesar. So close that when they opened Caesar's will after he died, Caesar declared Octavian, Gaius Octavian by another name, to be his son. He adopted him after his death. One of the strange results of this is that this meant that Octavian actually could call himself Gaius Caesar. Remember, we had Gaius Julius Caesar, now we have Gaius Octavian Caesar. This Gaius Caesar now has, at very least, the appearance of authority, the appearance of a dynasty, which does a lot for his image. Additionally, during this time, Mark Antony is begun an affair with Cleopatra as well. That's not only kind of seen suspiciously, given Julius Caesar, like everyone's getting worried about Julius Caesar for the same thing, but it's also seen as this could be a potential alliance between the Queen of the East and the Roman Empire, and that has a lot of senators especially worried. And so after what is basically a strategic campaign of information, Octavian is the winner, the ultimate. He's recognized to be the empire by the Senate, and drives Mark Antony out. Now, interestingly enough, he refuses to take any titles that would be associated with kingship at this time. He's taken the name Caesar already. Now, keep in mind, Caesar is really just a name. It's not the title that it's going to become. When the empire gets divided, Caesar becomes a title. But for now, it's just a name. But he has that name now. And so he takes Caesar as a name, as if to say, in some ways, what my predecessor, his adopted father, was doing, he's going to do. He also takes the name Augustus. Augustus comes from like August, or that's sometimes an English word. Actually, that's partially where my son gets his name, August. August, which is like a superlative, like great or greatest, something like that. August is also used in terms of piety as well. And so in the Roman world, if you were August, you were particularly pious. And it could have even designated a level of holiness that was God-like. Okay? So what was Augustus saying about himself? What was Octavian saying about himself? Was he saying that he was pious, or was he saying that he's God-like? He kind of kept it ambiguous. Similarly, he took the title of Principate, which is like first citizen. And so what does he mean by that? Does he mean that he is one of many citizens, but just kind of designated the first? Or does he mean that he is the head of the citizens? There's ambiguity. No one's exactly sure. And then last but not least, and this is probably the most important, he takes the title of Imperatus, which is going to be the thing that people shout when a military commander, a general, wins either a war or a great battle or something like that. He is considered the Imperatus. And so by taking this title permanently, here he's making the most definitive statement about his position. But what he doesn't take is he doesn't take the title consul. He doesn't take any of the magistrate titles, even though he takes their power. He takes the imperium, he takes their authority, and so he becomes someone who has the ability to do all of the magistrate positions, but no one calls him those titles. And unlike his adopted father, he doesn't wear purple. He wears white, which is more or less what everyone else would have worn. He wears a traditional white toga. He doesn't sit in a fancy chair. He doesn't have any headgear. Even if you were to look at statues of Augustus, Octavian, very rarely will you see him adorned with the laurel wreath as well too. He takes a more modest position. He also tries to reform Rome's opulence at this point. He saw that one of the big reasons that there were so many civil wars, which he kind of glossed over, but there were a lot of civil wars during the movement of power. The end of the empire, or the end of the republic, was really not that it was all cracked up to be. Sometimes people will bemoan the end of the republic as if like, oh, it's so sad, if only they could have held things together for a bit longer. It was extremely clear, at least towards the last couple hundred years of the republic, that if they didn't figure something out, they were going to kill each other. There was constant power struggles. And by Augustus stepping into power, he begins to move into an age of relative peace and stability. It's not total peace and stability, as we're going to see, especially with the change in power of the emperors from hereafter. It's not going to be a unanimous peace. Further, Augustus himself, I believe, I have to double check on this, but I believe he never actually is declared emperor by the Senate or by any sort of ruling authority that would have the power to do so. Instead, he kind of just takes the power for himself and is allowed to do that, really. It's not until his predecessors after him that this becomes more common. Augustus also sets up the Praetorian Guard, which first is kind of a separate militia for the emperor in order to protect the emperor, whether in battle or in the Eternal City, Rome. But the big thing too is that Praetorian Guard becomes an electoral force for further emperors as well too. So he begins to set up the ways that further emperors are going to be. You could call it elected, you could call it nominated, you could call it installed or something like that. But that's quite important. Augustus tries to expand the Roman Empire, into the Balkan Peninsula. The Balkan area is near the Balkan Mountains, everything pretty much south of that where you see Greece, and you can move over into like Syria, Iraq, Iran, that area today. you're getting further east there. Not quite that far, not far into to modern day Iraq and Iran. That's Balkan area for the Roman Empire medieval area. When we talk about the Balkans, that's generally the loose territory that we're talking about. Rather than if we talk about north, we're going to usually refer to Germanic tribes. If we talk about west, we're oftentimes talking about Gaul, the Iberian Peninsula. Obviously, we're talking about Spain and North Africa. We're talking about that narrow little sliver, including what is modern day Morocco and Carthage, Tunis now, and all of this area. So there's a quick geography lesson for you. But the Balkan area is where he kind of begins to invade. And he's hopeful, but he's extremely unsuccessful. One of the biggest reasons that he deems that he's unsuccessful is because the Roman Empire is just so big, it's beginning to become unwieldy. So his army is largely massacred in 9 AD, and there's, like he said, like 3 waves of armies, and is fought off by a man named Varus, and he decides, you know what, the empire is big enough. We're going to just keep it at status quo. He focuses instead on increasing the birth rate of the society, increasing the morals of the society, increasing the piety of the individuals. He wants to make sure that there is a sense of worship in the air. Like these are pagan gods that they're worshiping, but he sees Romans to have kind of gotten a little too laxed on things. And this is kind of the legacy that he leaves, is someone who's able to bring things together. And he leaves the empire in a state of consistency. He reigns for something like 45 years. And so by the time he's dead, when you add on Julius Caesar and the years of instability right before Julius Caesar's reign, the civil wars that are happening, there's pretty much no one left that even remembers the Republic. It's gone from memory. So at that point, the empire is really the only way that people know how to move forward. And like I said, ironically, this causes a lot of stability. There's more to the dynasty of Augustus. We call it the Julio-Claudian dynasty, simply because this continues through the line of Julius Caesar and is it one of his wives or one of Augustus's wives? I can't remember. It continues down through them. The Julio-Claudian dynasty brings us to Nero. And this is when we have to kind of move over on the map and think about what's been happening at the same time. As you're remembering your Christian history, you're probably thinking, okay, so the wars that Augustus is having is 9 AD, right? I tend to take the traditional view of Christ's birth, that he was born at 1 AD. But even if you give or take 5 years with that, right? Christ is a young boy at the time of Julian or of Augustus's military conquests. There's stability in the Roman Empire, but there's especially on the peripheries when you get as far as Syria. There's a spirit of unrest still, and this really goes all the way back to Alexander the Great. And his conquest of that area as well too. During that time, a lot of Jews fled down to Alexandria in northern Egypt. Alexander the Great Hellenized the area of Christ, and so you have a lot of Jewish-speaking individuals there as well. Some Greek culture that's kind of invaded the area as well, and the Jewish people are divided up into 4 or 5 main groups, maybe even more, depending on how you want to think about it. The 4 traditional groups are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. And the 5th one might be the Samaritans. Let's think about those for just a second. The Pharisees are, we can think of like Paul's lineage, right? They believe in an expanded, or what we think of closer to just like the Old Testament, right? They think of a long format Old Testament. They have the entirety of the works of God in Israel as everything they're looking at. They believe in things like the resurrection from the dead. They believe in, there's a few other distinctives that I'm blanking on. The Sadducees, on the other hand, most likely only believed in the first 5 books of Scripture. And so because of that, if you read through the first 5 books with a particular eye to things like the resurrection, you're going to find it's really difficult, actually. So even when Christ is conversing with the Sadducees, he has very interesting ways of creating debates with them. It's pretty fascinating, right? He looks back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and says, "Oh, but we worship the God of the living and not of the dead." The reason he's doing that and not going to some more obvious places in Psalms is because the Sadducees are more likely, they're not going to find that as a persuasive argument. So those are 2 camps. Then you have another camp, which is the Zealots. And the Zealots, of which Simon Peter is part of, when we meet him, he is an ex-Zealot, which is going to be really interesting because we're going to see him go to Rome eventually. He's going to live out the exact inverse of his Zealot life. Simon, formerly Simon, who becomes Peter, he is a Zealot, which means that he wants to overthrow the Romans, right? Or not necessarily just the Romans, right? Maybe a little overthrow of everyone. This is kind of where we get like Peter's rough and gruff mentality, where he wants to go and see some carnage, right? This doesn't go well for a lot of the Zealots, right? The Roman Empire is massive, and they're not that interested in allowing chunks of people to just overthrow their reign, even if it's as far away as Galilee or Jerusalem or something like that. And then you have the Essenes. Now the Essenes had disagreed that the temple that was established, Herod's temple as it's sometimes called, that was established during the time of Christ, they don't believe that temple is really valid. There's a couple of reasons that they might not think that. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that they think that is the correct place to worship, but that they see the temple practices as null and void right now. And so they've completely retreated. They've started doing some of their own studies. They are meticulous note takers, thankfully. They give us a lot of great documents that we can look at today and see what life during that time was like and what religious texts looked like. They have a similar canon to the Sadducees, but slightly different, or to the Pharisees, pardon me, but slightly different. And they practice things that look surprisingly similar to baptism and communion, right? They're definitely doing some quasi-Baptist stuff. It's why people tend to think that John the Baptist might have been in Essene. And they're also seeming to do these interesting feasts where they break bread and pass around different cups of wine and bless them in certain ways. That at least seem to be reminiscent of something that we see later in the Gospels. And then there's the Samaritans, who worship on a completely different mountain and thus have a completely different temple and a completely different cultic system. By cultic, we just mean a system of worship and sacrifices. And so they're all doing their own thing. So this whole region is completely broken apart in a lot of different ways, religiously, all under Rome's authority at this point, at least very loosely. And after Christ dies, and he's put to death, one of the reasons that he's put to death, amongst, seems like at least a few, is that the Jews were very worried, especially the Sadducees and the Pharisees were very worried that Christ was going to cause a rebellion by claiming to be the Messiah, because he was going to look like he's overthrowing the Roman rule, and the Romans are just going to come there, they're going to destroy the temple, and they're going to completely knock out what Judaism has going for it at the time. And they're very worried about that because that's more or less what happened during the time of Alexander the Great and the Maccabean revolts. And so instead, they put Christ to death. Ironically, after there's a lot of tumultuousness between Paul's missionary journeys, he's going in and out of Jerusalem, he's being taken out and snuck out, and he's eventually trying to get to Rome, and he's going to get to Rome, and Peter's also going to get to Rome, and they're going to be both martyred there. Traditionally, Peter is martyred at Nero's Circus, which is approximately where we have St. Peter's Basilica today. And after all of this, in the mid-60s, 64 AD, there is another Jewish rebellion. And this Jewish rebellion lasts about 6 years. And they are actually able to kick out the Romans and to take authority of Jerusalem in particular. That lasts for, like I said, about 6 years until Rome comes back with fury and in 70 AD destroys the temple and kicks the Jews largely out. Not entirely. We're going to see that they get kicked out entirely in like 160s area, in 164 or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. But for now, they're kicked out of Jerusalem. Roman rule has been established. And this is going to send practicing Jews, whether Christians or non-Christians, all over, but especially into Rome. And this is why Rome, during the time after Christ's life, and especially after the destruction of the temple, gets flooded with extremely poor Jews who are primed to hear the gospel and who are also looking at this extremely politically. And so there's kind of some bubblings of what's going on here. The difficulty with Christianity and Judaism, for that matter, for the Romans, is the Romans had this tendency of Romanization where they would conquer a land. They would say, great, your art is going to be included in our world now. Your music is what we take. And in fact, we're going to bring your gods into our religion. And it's going to be a big religion with a pantheon of gods. This is where you have the pantheon, right, that Hadrian builds. And this whole pantheon ultimately is going to be the Roman religion. And we're going to have just all the gods on our side. Well, both Christianity and Judaism are remarkably exclusive. And at this point, it's not even really fair to think of Christianity and Judaism as two completely separate things. Right? Certainly, they do have completely different understandings of the Messiah. But it seemed like a lot of Christians still consider themselves to be Jews, just a unique stripe of Jew at this time. And this is one of the big questions that actually gets up and going during the New Testament and during Acts. Okay, so there's all this kind of chaos that's going on in the empire. During this time, Nero starts persecuting a lot of the Christians. He's largely accused of setting fire to Rome. Some people say that that's unfair. Regardless of whether it's fair or unfair to say that he set fire to Rome, he blamed the Christians for doing so. And this caused a lot of persecution during his time of the Christians. Around this time, too, Christians were no longer able to bury their dead, which was a big deal for Christianity, right? We believe in the resurrection of the dead. And because of that, they had to find a way to bury their dead, and they would typically do it illegally in the catacombs. And okay, this is all largely happening in what we think of as the Julio-Claudian dynasty. After the Julio-Claudian dynasty comes the Flavian dynasty, and that goes up to almost 100 BC, 100 AD, 96 AD, which is right around the same time that the Apostle John dies. Once the Apostle John dies, we have a series of 5 good emperors. Oh, pardon me. No, this is right. 5 good emperors, which we can think of as the adoptive emperors. And they're known as that because besides the first one and the last one, none of them are emperors by blood. And this is maybe part of the reason that they're really good emperors is because they're all chosen when they're older in life. And the previous emperor, just like Julius Caesar with Octavian, adopts the next emperor as a way of establishing him. And so that kind of becomes a way of getting the imperial rule going. At this point, it had not become entirely common for the voting system that we talked about earlier with the military to actually be choosing the emperors. That's going to come later. The Praetorian Guard will do that eventually, just not quite yet. Okay, so this adoptive empire, which is also known as the Nerva Antonine dynasty, has 5 good emperors and a couple of not so great emperors. And Lucius Verus is the second to last one. His son, the only blood son of the adoptive emperor's dynasty, besides the first, is Commodus. Commodus is a famously bad emperor. And it's really under him that that there's a huge amount of military strife. There's a huge amount of questions as far as what in the world is happening for Roman society. And finally, a foreign emperor from North Africa, Septus Severus, ends up coming forward and taking charge of the Roman military and indeed becoming the next emperor in his place. He's a relatively fine guy. As far as he reestablishes some peace and then begins another dynasty of rulers called the Severian rulers. from there on out, it's kind of hit and miss. There's a lot of backstabbing. This is like the golden age, the peace of Rome, of those 5 good emperors, is kind of put to an end in the Severian Empire. The economics of the Roman society are bad. People are extremely poor. And especially in that southern area of Rome, people are in dire need for stability. And Christianity begins to offer that left and right and center, not actually by offering stability itself, but by explaining pain, explaining tragedy, and explaining suffering through their dying God. Unlike the strength of the Roman Empire and the Roman cultus, like the system of worship, the pantheon, Christianity has something to offer the poor. That is a God who dies. And that resonates with the lowest of the lows in Roman society. And it begins to cause rumblings. And those rumblings are going to make a big difference, especially when we come to the later Roman empires, and especially none other than Constantine himself. In the next unit, we begin to look at the crash and fall of the Roman Empire, what led to it, and where we go from there as we actually begin the official movement into medieval territory. Okay, I apologize, this is a longer video, but I think it's helpful context. If you have any questions on anything, please feel free to ask. There's a lot more information in the books, and there's a lot more information in my head that I'm not going to extend this video for any longer for. I hope you understand that as well, but I'm happy to talk about it at length. But 36 minutes is plenty long enough for a summary video. Okay, I will see you all for the test on Friday. Please don't forget. I look forward to it.